Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Shreya, and on behalf of the London Committee of the Young Mining Professionals, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel event. For those of you who are new to the Young Mining Professionals, we are a growing association of global mining professionals that support the skills and knowledge growth to advance your profile and career options. Please check us out on LinkedIn and our website to find out more. For today, please remember to submit your questions through the Q&A function. Now, I'm very excited to hand over to Peter Toth from Rio Tinto to introduce himself, our topic, and our panelists. Over to you, Peter.
Ria, thank you ever so much for, first of all, for the opportunity to join your panel discussion today. My name is Peter Toth, and I am the Group Executive in charge of Strategy and Development at Rio Tinto. And for the last 3 years, my portfolio, as part of my strategy mandate, has included developing our climate strategy, and I'm increasingly picking up other pieces of our sustainability activities and bringing it under the one roof. So it's I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our panelists. The topic for today is discovering the role of mining in a circular economy. And also, I suspect, in reverse, what is the role of circular economy in mining at the same time. As you all know, the mining industry is very committed to delivering on its sustainability goals. And today's panel will discuss how mining currently operates within a circular economy and where there may be additional opportunities. So, our excellent panel today, pleasure to introduce Akshai Fofaria, who is a partner at Pinsent Masons, and he's an emerging market specialist in the field of energy, natural resources and infrastructure. He co-leads Pinsent Masons Africa Group and leads the firm's mining group. And Akshai specializes in the negotiation of projects and transactions in the energy, natural resources and infrastructure space. And he also advises investors on emerging and frontier market risk strategies. Ashley Morris, it's my pleasure to introduce Ashley. Ashley is based in Australia, so thank you very much for staying up on a Friday night for us. Ashley is the co-founder and CEO of Rio. Ashley is bold in her pursuit of systemic change, acknowledged as a future leader. Ashley was recently presented with the Young Business Persons of the Year award by the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, and also recognized as a global top 100 corporate social responsibility influential leader. She's a Prime Minister scholar, an Australian Asian emerging leader, and an invitee to the 73rd United Nations General Assembly, and an Ellen MacArthur Foundation Circular Economy Champion, which is a title granted to only a handful of people worldwide. With recognition of her strategic foresight and experience, Ashley has met with several Australian Prime Ministers and was invited on government trade missions and represented Australia as a panelist and as a speaker at the World Circular Economy Forum in 2019. Our next panelist is Ben Davies. Ben leads the Materials Stewardship and Circular Economy Group at Anglo American, a company which needs no introduction, with a portfolio that spans from diamonds, platinum, copper, iron ore, and other important commodities. Anglo American is embracing circular economy and recognizes its alignment with the company's purpose, which is to reimagine mining to improve people's lives. Ben is a physicist and materials scientist by training, and has nearly 20 years experience working with the world's largest mining and metal companies on a range of issues related to sustainability development. Last but not least, Douglas Johnson Ponsgan, who's the founder and CEO of Circular, a company whose mission is traceability and due diligence of raw materials, from source to manufacturers, by using blockchain and artificial intelligence. And Doug describes himself as a strategist by nature, an engineer by training, and a serial entrepreneur and a successful disruptor. He has 25 years international experience as an executive and non-executive director operating in the tech, media and telecom sector, financial services, IT and management consulting. So thank you all on the panel for joining the discussion today. And I'll hand it back to you, Shreya.
Thank you. And Peter, feel free to answer any of our questions because I'm sure you'll have plenty to say. Okay, so we have a very diverse and experienced panel, and circular economy is such a large topic. So I guess just an easy one to start with. What does circular economy mean to you, and what value do you think it brings to a business? So Ashley, we might kick off with you, and any other panelists that want to follow up, please feel free.
Great, thanks Shreya, and thank you Peter for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be here, and I think it's a very important topic. So for me, I acknowledge that today's linear economy isn't working for us, and we're too busy working for it to often take a step back and to see the systemic picture. For me, the circular economy presents an opportunity to focus not on ourselves and our limited vision of profits and losses in the near future, but to look to the horizon to contemplate the commodity itself and the holistic and inherent value it will retain into the future, beyond our annual reports, beyond our mortgages, beyond even our children or our grandchildren's lifetimes. The circular economy will introduce transformative changes that design waste and pollution out of our products and our services, while focusing on capturing greater economic value throughout the supply chain by rethinking conventional linear business models. The only thing in my view standing in the way of that systemic change is our own imagination and ingenuity. So my question to you today is, and as we dive into this dialogue, is to think, why don't we servitize our metals? Why not capture the full value of our efforts? And why not go beyond recycling, beyond minimizing our carbon footprints and beyond damage control? Why not fully address the business imperative to rethink mining as a regenerative, responsible and resourceful industry?
That's such an important question, Ashley. I'm not sure if anyone wants to follow up on that.
Yeah, I'm just going to chip in here. I mean, just briefly, context for those listening. We're a technology company, and we're working primarily in the battery materials space. And whether it's downstream car manufacturers looking to source responsibly and understand the embedded carbon in the supply chain, or upstream producers, and we're working with both managed artisanal sites in the Congo, as well as some of the world's largest mining companies, looking to attach ESG metrics to the materials that are shipped today, but picking up on the terminology that Ashley just talked about, the linear economy, i.e. the primary supply of materials. Increasingly, once you have found a way to digitize a commodity and follow it on a journey, you actually have the basis then for a circular economy business model. If you're going to I think Ashley used the term servitize the materials, or effectively lease materials to, for example, the EV battery supply chain. You need to know where it is and what its state of health is, and of course that opens up a spectrum beyond recycling at the end of the first life in the first vehicle to a second and possibly third life for those materials prior to them being recycled. And of course, we all know that things like batteries are very polluting to create, and actually it is not in our collected interests as a society at large to recycle them at the end of their first use. Better, far better, not to invest further energy into it at the end of the first life in order to give it a meaningful second life before you do that. But you can't lease battery materials to a battery supply chain without knowing where they are. And so, there is a role for technology in this. The other barrier to these sorts of things, of course, is that today's traditional business models are not geared up for these kind of 30-year timeframes potentially for things like metals. And there's a major challenge. We're having the same conversation with oil and gas majors who are looking at things like leasing lubricant to shipping, which faces very similar challenges, although the life cycle is shorter.
That's a really great point. And maybe Ben, we can go to you next. Yeah. You work for a large operator. So where are we headed in mining based on what Doug is saying?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? Because I think quite often the reaction when we start talking about circular economy is, why is a mining company interested in that? You know, it's seen as something that is for the downstream, that's all about recycling. And I guess that's one of the nuances. You know, it's circular. The first thing to say, circular economy is about so much more than recycling, and I think that's probably the first thing that we talk about. But I think for us, it's really about, you know, looking for opportunity and also looking for where the risks are coming from us. So we got very interested in circular economy a couple of years ago, and because we didn't really have anything to say about circular economy. But the more we look at circular economy, the more we see that we're doing a huge amount of stuff that talks absolutely to the circular economy. So, you know, I think that's really interesting, is that there's a lot of work that we do in generally in sustainability, and we do stuff that we do just because it makes good business sense, and because that's the way the world's moving, that you can actually badge quite nicely as circular economy, which is interesting. So we found when we looked at you know, Anglo today, that there's a lot there that we're doing. But if we think a little bit more about the circular business models that are emerging, you know, and particularly driven by tech, I think driven by connectivity, driven by the sort of revolution that's happening in materials science, biomaterials, all of these things, then we see even better ways of doing things. So there's a kind of tier, if you like, of the circular economy, that we can look at our business today and design much better ways of doing what we're doing, doing things more efficiently. But I think the really interesting stuff is when we start looking outside that as well and say, how do we take a much more, you know, systemic view? We can start looking not as we, you know, traditionally done as a mining sector, as being, you know, the best diggers of a hole, but actually as changing our business model. You know, I think we're all thinking of ourselves now as materials providers, you know, mining and metals companies. And I think the future's in this kind of material solutions and services. And it's circular economy is one of those really interesting concepts that begins to link us up much better with the value chains, I think, to Douglas's point. And, you know, can we get our materials into the high value applications, those ones that, you know, can deliver most value to society? Because I think we can see from everything, from the debate around carbon, particularly, because I think that's at the forefront, but also in other things, that's really what people are demanding, and that's what we need to do for the planet and for us. So, look, I think it's really interesting. So we have this huge opportunity on one hand. It's also helping us manage risks and business disruption. You know, we're an industry that, I said to somebody the other day, you know, Anglo American, we're a 100-year-old company with a 100-year-old business model, and he said, that's kind. He said, I think it's an industry with a 30,000-year-old business model. And the disruption that we're seeing in, you know, other sectors, when we look at tech, we look at the biological science, everything else, that's coming our way. And I think that what we can see in circular economy is some of the clues already as to what the business models of the future are. So it's very exciting for us in that respect. I think it's helping us here and now, but it's also helping us look into the future.
Yeah. Could I compliment just quickly what Ben was saying, also what Doug shared? I think that's right on point. It's great to hear the perspective for someone delivering a technical solution and someone working obviously in the operations themselves. Because we work cross-sectorally as well, and with a lot of the majors in this space. What we do find is there's a fantastic foundation of circular economy already within the organizations, but what is lacking is that systemic and strategic lens and view, and how we've looked to connect up the initiatives that have been invested in and driven forward. They're often isolated, so this ad hoc approach, whilst beneficial, is definitely not getting the compounded benefit and returns that I believe could be achieved if there was a systemic-led approach. So we often silo solutions as much as we silo how we operate today. I think that's part of this, having to shift and think differently, see things differently, and then take the action to implement it in the same vein.
Regulators are starting to help, by the way. I mean,
yes.
In Europe, we've just published the latest iteration of the battery regulations, which require consideration of second life at the point of recycling, and also try and overcome Europe's strategic over-reliance on China for example, battery materials, which, you know, with many of the large miners producing materials like nickel in all sorts of places that are not China, actually does create an impetus for circular economy business models, leasing battery metals rather than simply selling them.
And exactly where I was going to head to next,
Sorry.
Doug. No, absolutely, you're right on. So just taking some of that strategic lens, it sounds like, you know, it's very much been business driven by social needs. And, you know, there needs to be this strategic context to it to help develop some of these partnerships, and people can then, you know, industry and government can work together. So I guess, Akshay, a question for you from a legal perspective. What is the legal landscape? What does it look like? What are the incentives or the obstacles in making this happen? Sorry, might have lost your audio.
It's very, very interesting to hear from both from Ashley and Ben and Douglas on these issues. I mean, I've done a little bit of a survey of the current regulation in this space, and I have to say it's pretty haphazard and sporadic. And as Ashley said, it's very siloed. I mean, you look at it, it's fundamentally driven by programmed obsolescence, which everybody recognizes as a bad thing. And you see that in the EU circular economy package. You see it in certain countries like France that have put in place bans. And there's some haphazard regulation around, producer pays principles and making sure that there's good stewardship of products. So, companies have to recover products at the end of their life cycle. And we talked about batteries just now, portable devices, packaging, cars. But again, this just skates around the surface, and there aren't really any sort of targeted fiscal incentives to encourage circular behavior and the designing of all of these products. So that's looking at it from sort of the manufacturer's perspective, but just for the purpose of this discussion, and it was really interesting to hear Ben talk about a more systemic approach and a systemic perspective by majors like Anglo. And I think that's fascinating because, having worked in the oil and gas space as well, I've noticed that a lot of the effort around decarbonization is focused on the process of extracting oil and gas. But it's not focused on the purpose of the particular industry. And I think there is an interesting division between process and purpose. You can make the process more planet friendly or planet positive by using tailings properly, or reusing waste, or making sure that the water in the effluent isn't put in the right place or it's reused. But purpose is something which is a much more difficult conundrum to crack. I mean, if you look at the marketing materials of Philip Morris, it's about identifying a smokeless future. And whilst that's kind of disingenuous by Philip Morris, if the mining industry isn't going to achieve that level of notoriety in terms of the way they present themselves to the market, they're going to have to think about a couple of things. The first is that there are headwinds and tailwinds for the mining industry arising out of this situation. You're going from high carbon to high metals, because we need metals for solar panels, for wind farms, for all manner of stuff in the green economy. So there is a very big tailwind for the mining industry in this green revolution. At the same time, you've got a headwind, which is what we've just spoken about, which is around progressive consciousness on the part of the next generation, perhaps not this generation, but the next one, that we need to stop resource extraction. And it's going to be pretty binary. If you look at cancel culture currently in universities, you can see what's coming down the line. And my sense is, if it's time now for the miners to probably invest in understanding what it is to be a good actor in this space, and how you measure what a good actor is in this space. And there's a degree of standardization that needs to happen. And before it's imposed upon the mining industry, it's probably incumbent on that industry to identify the metrics which are going to be able to apply to every different market participant. And why do I say that's important? Because those metrics are the building blocks for regulation. Until you have those metrics in place and you understand, we have it in the climate space in oil and gas, we have carbon pricing. We understand what it is. We understand what a carbon footprint is. We measure it in tons. But those metrics are very difficult to analyze, in terms of planet positivity. And I'd like to point to a couple of examples which I think might be interesting for the mining sector. Now, you might say, well, how can mining companies influence how materials are used and whether they end up in disposable jackets from Primark or towards photovoltaic materials? And I'm not suggesting this is a recommendation, but it's coming down the pipe. And my answer to that was, well, do you remember the Kimberley process, around blood diamonds? The mining sector understands that. They know that, they put in place regulations back in the early 2000s around satisfying minimum requirements, national legislation, committing to transparent processes, collecting data, trading with only fellow members, certifying shipments. Now, it's not a very short hop from that to something using blockchain technology, as the gentleman mentioned earlier on, to be able to track the destination of product and to play the role as an arbiter of that in a healthy manner, to take responsibility for the entire life cycle. And what does that mean? We're going to have to grade market participants. Is that so difficult if we have the right metrics in place? I mean, if you look at South Africa and the broad-based Black economic empowerment, We already do that. I mean, it's not something that works necessarily extremely well, but we do grade market participants in that market without banning certain behaviors, without saying you can't sell to X or Y. We create incentives around a certain level of identification of good and bad actors or better actors. And then we can also point to another set of regulations which the mining industry are used to, which is local content. Miners have to satisfy local content procurement requirements. I mean, they operate in a certain African country. You need to procure from certain market participants. Now, it's not a very long hop to say, well, we'll regulate the procurement of where you get your raw materials versus we'll regulate where you sell them to. We already regulate those types of relationships. So I think there are some existing examples of regulation which can be repurposed, to use a kind of climate-friendly term, to apply to the circular economy in a manner which I think the industry will understand and investors will understand. That's kind of where I see it.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Akshay. That was a great explanation. So I've got two things at the top of my mind at the moment. Doug, it'd be really great to understand a little bit more about circular, just based on what Akshay has talked about in terms of using a technology platform to have this ability to track. And then secondly, I guess, Ben, Peter, Ashley, what are some of those good practices that we're seeing, that we're starting to build into the mining industry? As Akshay said, there's so many opportunities out there. What are some of those good leading examples, or what are those opportunities that we might be missing?
Yeah, thank you. By the way, I really enjoyed that explanation around regulation. That there are some other drivers of change as well. You've got exchanges like the London Metal Exchange currently has its sustainability strategy out for consultation, which foresees a spot market for ESG claims. So if you're selling green aluminium, well, how do you attach claims to parcels of material? And I'll come onto that in a sec from a technology perspective without going all nerd on you all. And the other driver is coming also from institutional investors. Increasingly, if you are particularly polluting, the pool of capital available to you is shrinking and the cost of capital is going up. And that may well be where regulation can create a lowest common denominator that improves over time. Actually, there's an existential crisis. I mean, without wishing I understand the value of things like metallurgical coal, but generally coal mining has a bad rap. And actually, how many pension funds today would be keen to be associated with coal mining? I suspect that group is shrinking, and so that may well have a faster impact than regulation. So let's just briefly talk about technology then. So we're a business that uses a combination of blockchain, traditional databases, machine learning, in order to create a digital twin for a commodity at its source, which could be something as small as a 30-kilo bag of cobalt ore from a mine site in the Congo, or a 200-ton parcel of nickel coming from Western Australia. And then following that digital twin of that commodity on its journey through a supply chain. And of course, the complexity, which we all know, is that the material undergoes multiple transformations on its journey, whether it's smelting and refining or amalgamation with other materials, and then its incorporation within something that becomes something completely different. Take the battery, which I referred to earlier, or smelting, refining, amalgamation, or sintering with other materials, simply to create the cathode powder that is coated on copper that ends up in a battery cell that eventually, alongside others, becomes a battery module in a car. We're today tracking battery materials successfully from mines into cars. Every single Volvo electric vehicle today coming off the production lines in Ghent and Liuqiao in China comes with that traceability that I have just described. And we're working both with upstream and downstream, and the midstream participants obviously share data as well, not only to demonstrate the flow of materials, but to attach an attributable slice of scope 1 and 2 emissions based on which participant touched how much of what raw material over time, so that you have an embedded carbon figure per battery. And obviously, from the regulatory perspective, that's what the EU battery regulations will require. But actually, the purpose of doing it today is actually to enable a procurement director inside a car manufacturer like Volvo or Polestar or Jaguar Land Rover to be able to use that sustainability data alongside what they know about price and quality in order to use procurement as a way of reducing the carbon footprint. there'll be a whole selection of potential cathode producers. Some use more renewable energy than others. Therefore, there are more sustainable routes through these supply chains. You have to be able to see them in order to specify them. And today, what I'm describing is happening with CATL and LG Chem, two of the largest battery manufacturers, and others are starting to look at this actively too. And increasingly, upstream actors looking to differentiate their product by attaching ESG metrics to it. Finnish Minerals Group and Vulcan Energy this month both announced, arrangements with us to do exactly that, to take their material and attach their sustainability credentials to that material as it goes on the supply chain as a way of differentiating their product. Now, I know we're talking about the circular economy, but the lesson from all of that is if you can do it in the primary supply of materials through the supply chain, you can do it for the circular economy as well.
Thank you. I guess then, Ashley, Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to jump on the back up. Sorry, you go, Ben.
Oh, thanks, Peter. No, look, I think this issue, the sort of the ethical value chain issue, is fundamentally connected, because it's ultimately that's about footprint, and it's the impact and of those products. And I think circular economy principles, again, coming back to what we said at the beginning, there's a lot that we can do within the business today that is circular and that reduces the footprint. So the way that we handle waste and emissions, the way we design those kind of processes, eliminating physical waste, but eliminating wasted capacity in the equipments we use, the processing we use, all of those things, we can take a really good look at those with circular economy principles. And the other thing, which actually doesn't get captured very well in circular economy, is perhaps the one weakness in terms of is the social dimension. And I think where we operate, we're seeing huge benefit in doing this kind of thing. If you look at waste projects, there's almost always a really good community angle around what we can do with beneficiation of non-mineral waste across our business. Our platinum business units had a zero to landfill target at the end of the year, which they hit. And the really interesting thing about that is it's generating opportunities to use those materials, and they're creating businesses, creating small community enterprises, which is really, really neat stuff that's happening. And why not? Why not do it? It's just, and what's really fascinating is we found that can actually pay for itself or generate revenue for us rather than being a cost. It's just purely the effort of doing it. So I think that's really, really quite an interesting thing. So those sort of initiatives are helping us reduce that footprint. But then it's the stuff that Douglas is talking about. How do we connect to the value chains better? And I'm absolutely in agreement. I think that this isn't, this is not something that's coming in 5 years' time. This is here today. I think when you see the number of agreements that are coming in, bilateral sort of supply agreements that are happening, there's new ones emerging all the time. And I think those are super interesting. It's also like, we've talked about social license to operate for quite a long time now, and looked at our business through that lens. It's transforming into a sort of social license to market issue, I think, because you've looked at your product footprints even on a global aggregated basis in the past, through things like LCI, LCA data. It's just not what people are asking for so much now. It's actually line of sight of a particular value chain. I think things are moving in that direction. So just finally, we have, when we talk about that connection downstream, if you look at the activities within Anglo-American, around PGM market development, for example, that's the thinking behind that, is that there is a role for us to play in a hydrogen economy. It's, when you look at our business model, why it might not be obvious at first, why we're investing so much in hydrogen, but then you look at, well, we need the energy for operations. There's a market there for platinum and for PGMs in the fuel cells and in that technology. It just makes perfect sense. So it's this kind of pivot you can already see in a business model, and I'm sure we'll have much more exposure in that industry in the future. So yeah, lots of interesting things. But I think this connection to the customers and what this demand in the supply chains for ethically sourced materials is really tied in very, very closely with circular economy.
Peter, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly. Look, just on the back of Doug's comments, I just wanted to make it's a Rio Tinto example, but this is more about technology than Rio Tinto. The aluminium colleagues have recently joined and issued a platform called STAR, which is all about putting a nutrition, it's like a digital footprint, it's blockchain technology, but it's like a nutrition label on the back of sort of product that's produced, and it's quite amazing how you can buy aluminium and have a nutrition label on it, and I think I'm just reading here, you've got 10 criteria that comes with the product. So when you buy that product, you get metrics and data on its carbon footprint, the water use, the recycled content, the energy sources, community investment, safety performance, diversity in leadership, business integrity, and regulatory compliance. So it is amazing how I think that sort of connecting the dots between the technology that's available and the actual the responsibly produced credentials of the product that comes with that. So I think, well, as I said, it's a real example that goes way beyond that aspect. The other aspect on the back of Ben's comments is that the real experience in terms of circular economy has been, we try to compartmentalize, as we always do, sort of full value mining and then sort of recycling, right? And then it's a bit like inside the gate, outside the gate. And the full value mining is reprocessing tailings, right? How can we take tailings and reprocess it and then extract any material that's left in it? Now, that's taken us into the critical minerals space, which is kind of good business because it's opened up, and it's a very, very highly politicized, it's a very geopolitical sort of landscape at the moment, critical minerals, but that's beyond the point. Once we step outside the gate, we lose our way a little bit, right? Because then it's recycling, and then sort of how does a mining company get involved in scrap collection and the scrap sorting, and then using that material into adding it into the remelt process? So, if you're an iron ore producer, do you go downstream and become sort of participant in the steel scrap industry? So that's a difficult question. It's a little bit easier in copper scrap and aluminium scrap. That's somewhere in between. But as Doug is talking about, batteries is interesting because it's kind of a new commodities, new technologies, new products. So can we rewrite the rules in terms of battery recycling just on the back of that we further down the sort of the thinking and opportunity generation, and also the technology comes to help as well. So
on that point about recycling versus virgin material, virgin material comes with a very significant embedded carbon footprint, for example, and actually already we see some of the downstream car manufacturers actively specifying recycled material because it's perceived to have a lower embedded carbon, and doesn't come with, particularly if you're talking about materials like lithium, cobalt and nickel, doesn't come with the concerns you might have about responsibly sourcing it. So actually for mining companies to get involved in the full circular life cycle of materials will help overcome some of that either or choice.
Yeah,
I think it's
I agree. Sorry, actually, go ahead.
No, you're jumping. Go.
No, I was going to say I completely agree, and I think it's just a balance the whole time, and not being too reductive in this approach, because those materials also don't come with hundreds of thousands of jobs in some of the poorest countries in the world. So it's a really complex one when we start boiling these materials down into numbers. So you're gaining somewhere, losing somewhere else, and I think that's the real challenge for us, is to continue to be able to have that narrative around social benefits as well as the footprint. So the kind of handprinting, I guess, is where the aluminium sector is going with some of this stuff. The benefits in the materials tends to be in use benefits, but I think capturing the full life cycle of that would be something that we really need to do as a sector.
Can I just add something, just to draw a parallel from the energy sector? If the regulation that's necessary to develop the circular economy eventually arrives, there are going to be fiscal disincentives for certain types of mine, almost certainly. And you're going to be in a situation where we're going to need greater rehabilitation frameworks and improved rehabilitation frameworks, because the above ground stock versus the flow is going to change in terms of its ratio. And what that means is effectively you're going to have to repurpose mines which are currently active into other things. Now, if you look at the oil and gas sector, Elon Musk is going to use these platforms to launch his starships. That's an extreme example, but some of them being repurposed for hydrogen development, for example, more realistically. And I think that there's going to be the need to regulate the point at which it becomes uneconomic, effectively, to maintain the continuance of these sites. And I think I see that coming down the pipeline. The second observation, just on what people have said, is I was very interested about the point made just earlier on about the social license to operate. It's really interesting now that we're reaching the point where regulation is too slow. It takes too much time for regulation to be implemented in a harmonious, holistic way across multiple jurisdictions in a manner which doesn't create a beggar thy nature situation. And so, when things are too slow, other things step into the vacuum. And so we're now seeing an investment license to operate, in a sense. You've got companies that operate across frontiers, but who have common global investors, who will have certain investor requirements from their own participants in terms of what is good and what is bad. And so I think increasingly mine is going to have to navigate the social license, the legal license, the investment license to operate. And all of those will create a matrix of rules which are going to need to be better understood and better framed. And I think there's an opportunity right now here for the sector to design those.
Ashley, I might actually just pick that up because I'm sure you watched it as well. So we had Scott Morrison speak on behalf of Australia at the Climate Change Summit. And, it's one of the few countries that didn't, extend its climate change targets. So Australia is very heavily dependent on mining. The government seems a little bit slow in the uptake, as Akshai was saying, the regulations not keeping up with the change. So in your experience, what have you seen and experienced with the mining industry in Australia? And you obviously saw a niche to set up Corio. So how have you found, are people coming to you? Is it word of mouth? How are you growing your business? And, is it something that people are interested in, I guess, in the mining industry?
Yeah, well, we are an extremely young company. We're only 4 years old, and I'm an environmental scientist by qualification. And I started this company on the back of a pilot project that just purely sought to understand what the circular economy meant in practice. Fantastic on paper, absolutely massive numbers when you talk about economic value to an economy and also carbon abatement. But again, if you talk to a business owner, most people here or business owners in Australia had no idea what you were talking about 4 years ago. Fast forward to today, they absolutely do. Our business has grown by word of mouth. We work with most of the major miners here in Australia across iron ore, aluminium, copper, met coal, and they are absolutely hungry for the circular economy. They are coming to us. And what I find though is there's strategic work that's done maybe globally in the London offices, and then there's the team on the ground at the sites thinking about how do they further, link up strategy here and operation there. And I've heard anecdotally, some of the GMs at sites say, you give me a person dedicated to circular economy, I'll have him on a loader now because production is king always. There's that is that mentality of this, we need to extract, we need to get it out, we need to have a transaction. But then there's a lot of shift also in the industry about asking the core question on purpose, our purpose of operating, what people in the business want to feel good about doing and going to work. And there is no denying that, the government is behind. Our government is definitely not one to look to for leadership. And it's, whether the industry is think that's a good thing or not in terms of there's no carbon tax, etc., or heavy related targets to climate performance. There's just, circular economy is not about a negative or a tax on industry. It's about an opportunity to do things better, economically, environmentally, and socially by looking at all of those parts as one interconnected system. There is good work already. It's just how we link it up. The social element is absolutely massive. And I think it's inherent within the businesses themselves, then it's broader into the society, the communities in which you operate. But to be honest, the biggest opportunity I see for the industry is moving from showing that you're extractive to actually showing that you are keeping materials at their highest value in the economy, in the environment, in society for as long as possible. That will change the complete identity of the industry, because right now it is extractive. You put it into the marketplace and you can't tell an individual where it goes. And I think what Doug is doing is amazing. If you are able to direct copper, for instance, into a wind turbine, and that company's maintaining that asset over its lifespan, you can report that copper is supporting the generation of X amount of renewable energy. Again, it'll just change the way people perceive the industry by giving greater transparency and talking about value, not extraction. I just think it's not about primary and recycled. it's so much bigger than that. And that's exciting. And I feel that excitement here in Australia. And I know the Canadian government, in terms of what was said earlier, they are leading a set of work about what are the guiding principles, frameworks that can support a set of standards globally amongst industry. And that conversation's been called Mining for Circularity. And we've had Mark Cutifani, the CEO of Anglo American, of course, feed into that. So there's some good progression happening, lots of market shifts, but ultimately it's a big opportunity. It's not a challenge.
So just picking up 2 points that you made there, Ashley, and maybe Peter and Ben, this is for you. So the first one being, how do you take something, that is a commitment by a company or a strategy and actually make it real, for the people at the assets or the operations, so they know that they're actually contributing to our, a company's sustainability or circular economy agenda. And the second one, do you actually have like all these people like Tesla and everyone knocking at your doors going, yep, we definitely want to do this. We want to make sure we're, ethically sourcing our raw materials and want to be able to track it. So have you found that there is a big demand, and are there those partnership opportunities out there?
Yeah, thanks. Look, on the second point, it's definitely growing. I think it's probably been a little bit slower than you might think from outside, just because of the way the value chains kind of work. But that is happening. Those conversations certainly, much more. It started. I guess it started with something a little bit different. It started with de-risking of supply chains. So, the volume of questionnaires that we have received from downstream over the last 5 years has just grown and grown and grown, and so it's becoming a little, so it's an evolution from that. Do no harm to let's source for more good, which is great, and that's the direction that we want to see things moving in. I think in terms of how we change things internally, a lot of it's about culture. And getting this sort of culture of circular economy thinking embedded within the company, and at every level, when we're taking decisions on how we plan work, how we design work, is there a different way of doing it? I think that's the question we want people asking. And so we're trying to do a few things along those lines internally. We're setting up big visible projects internally, so lighthouse projects that we're calling them, that we can just keep talking about, keep communicating around internally. And we have things there like things you wouldn't be surprised by them, tire recycling, recycling mineral wastes into soil conditions, these kind of things that we can actually do. Those operational circular economy programs, there are some of the marketing based ones as well, I think, with the market development around PGMs. But we're trying to make those things very visible and promote different ways of doing things, and for different outcomes. And we're also trying to encourage people to grow ideas. So we in a couple of months' time, we'll be launching our own incubator on circular economy within the company. So a way to just capture ideas from anybody across the whole company can put their ideas into this. We'll help them support ideas that we think there's mileage in. We'll put resources, not just funds, but people. Give them access to the people they need, and the places they need to be accessing within the company, and try and grow things from the bottom up. So there's quite a few things we're doing like that. Clearly, a link up with business strategy is critical for us. I think, just as this conversation with the outside world around circular economy has grown, I think, a couple of years ago was maybe not on the radar of the real strategic planners, but it certainly is now. That's a big change. And I think I think we're increasingly beginning to realize this is something we can't afford to ignore. It's not really about, and it's not necessarily about the returns we get today on these individual projects, but it's just about changing the way that we think, the way that our business planning strategy processes work, and looking for all of these opportunities, whether we call it circular economy or whether we call it something else. It's just about that change. I think that culture change.
Can I just chip in very quickly on the second part of your question, which Ben started with? Last year in the summer, an investor called Elon Musk was banging on about the importance of sustainable nickel. And obviously, he's got a pretty big megaphone, and that has created quite an interest right the way through the supply chain in sustainable nickel, including some wondering what the hell that might be, and how do you create it and differentiate your nickel? That's the driver behind, for example, some of the things that Finnish Minerals Group are doing, for example.
Just to the first part of your question, Sriya. I mean, you're part of some of the Rio conversations where I take our climate strategy on the road, and I just want to put a different spin on it. It's not about head office convincing employees that we need to go carbon free and abatement. It's actually head office living up to the expectations of our employees. How quickly can we get there? It's I read it somewhere that we're approaching the number of 75% of our employees are now millennials. So the game has changed. The expectations from bottom up in terms of our employees far exceed the speed at which sort of head office can go and articulate its carbon abatement targets and goal setting. So the revolution is from within. So I'm not worried about our employees, because the bottom up the development of ideas, raising of expectations, and asking for resources to be able to, here are the projects, please fund it, and please fund it differently. Don't try to apply your traditional investment criteria to this. This is not a 15% IRR project. This is a carbon abatement project or a circular economy project, which needs to be looked at completely different lens, sort of thing. So that is definitely happening, and it's really, really encouraging, because I need to do very little to convince the organisation that this is important. It's they're putting pressure on me, saying, how can we go faster? How can we be more ambitious?
Thank you. So we did have a couple of questions around shareholders. So, justifying this to shareholders, but we've talked about the benefits. We've talked about staying ahead of the regulation. We've talked about customers demanding it or wanting it. We've talked about the fact that, societal expectations are changing and technology is available. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add in terms of maybe showing any other benefits or being able to justify the cost of, or is there a cost in becoming more circular and efficient in mining?
What, to shareholders? I think
to shareholders, yes.
Large institutional investors are starting to agitate for this. Larry Fink at BlackRock is particularly vociferous about the quality or variability of ESG reporting, and that it's very easy to make glossy claims. They're not necessarily backed up with real action. And so, very large institutional investors are increasingly looking for real evidence of broader questions of environmental, social, and governance progress.
I think on that one, on Larry Fink, BlackRock does have a dedicated circular economy fund, and it started at 20 million in 2019. It's now 900 million and growing exponentially. But when I've talked to their team, and one of them is actually a former employee of BHP, they didn't feel that a mining company could be as part of that fund, which I find personally very interesting. And some of the leading, thought-leading organisations, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, again, they've taken a bit of a hard stance on mining's role in a circular economy. That's something that obviously that I'm passionate about breaking down, because I don't agree with it in principle, but it is very real. I guess in some of you, obviously they're a large shareholder of Rio Tinto and also BHP. This is BlackRock. But also, when they're driving their direction toward a circular economy, they're not seeing you in part of that journey. And I think that's something that needs to shift. How that shifts, I'm not exactly sure yet, but I think it is about creating these open dialogues about where the industry is at and the role in the circular economy for the industry and vice versa.
I think it's worth noting that there's a current underlying this conversation, which is a refounding of the nature of capitalism and how it operates to create the incentives necessary for this to occur. And I'm not a historian, but limited liability for major companies was originally the price or the payback for operating with a social purpose. So if you look at the charters of the ancient companies back in the 17th century, they wouldn't get limited liability unless they were operating with a particular state-driven purpose in mind. And we're seeing a hark back to some degree to that original purpose around the notion of corporates in terms of the new directors' duties and that are now emerging in many different countries. Originally the purpose was to look after your shareholders, but the set of stakeholders which directors are now obliged to look at to ensure that they are that good regard is had to them includes, to increasing degree environment, employees and others. So, beyond just the bog standard regulation around the system, the incentives and behaviors of directors are likely to change over time, not just because of pressure from investors.
I think that the interesting thing is that the investor pressure and interest is nothing new for the mining sector. So, the sector over the last 20 years has gone through so much change in this respect, and arguably there's no other sector that's transformed to the extent that mining has, in the way that it considers ESG in the way it operates, because it's needed to do that for investment, access to capital, access to land, essentially, from investors and governments. And I think that the missing stakeholder has always been the customer, the downstream, and the wider society. So looking at it through that lens of material stewardship. So I think there's a real danger for us at the moment in our sector, and I think we really got to keep getting that message across that this is. We're not doing these. The ESG component is not driven by circular economy. It's we've had to do that for the last 2 decades, and if you look at the transformation that the mining companies have made, it's phenomenal. As I say, there probably isn't another sector that's gone through that kind of journey. But I think linking it now to the products and the benefits of those products, so that we end up less isolated. I think this is my worry, is that there is this simplistic view: mining bad, metals good. You can be a fancy high-tech downstream circular economy company buying from a dirty mining company, but we sort of ignore that bit. And we need to be part of that conversation. We can't have that difference between the way we have to look at sustainability of the full value chains, the full impact. And I think that's for me, that's the exciting thing with what's changing around ethical value chains, the traceability, the whole narrative around circular economy. I think it's just a really exciting time.
Thank you so much. So before I hand back to Peter for a summary, I'm going to ask you all a personal question. So you're all so passionate about this topic, and I've actually learned so much, over the last hour. What actually attracted you to circular economy and sustainability? What was it? Were you just ahead of everyone else, and you knew this is where we were going in the industry? But what attracted you to it? Akshay, maybe we'll start with you. I think we've lost audio again.
Sorry, I said this attracts me. I find it interesting, not just from the perspective of mining, which is my core business, but the elephant in the room, which is consumer behavior. And I've always been concerned as to why consumers buy stuff and so much stuff. Funnily enough, there's a relationship between that and some elements of mining, probably gold mining, because the way in which our easy money system works and our inflationary system encourages people just to keep spending because the money's losing its value at a rate of knots. So that in turn has a deeper connection to certain elements of the metals industry. But from my perspective, the connection between that and the miners is an interesting one, and I don't think we should absolve all responsibilities from the end consumer.
Thank you. Ashley?
So I started this company, like I said, from a pilot project, and I'm an environmental scientist. And I had worked in Indonesia in palm oil, actually focused on deforestation with major companies, traders, growers of palm oil. And I realized through live satellite monitoring that this is the benefit of tech, similar to what Doug's doing now, providing visibility on a full length of a supply chain. But the problem was still getting worse because the overriding economy supports linearity, scale of production, massive consumption, massive negative externalities to the environment, to biodiversity, to us all ultimately. And I became, with that understanding, no longer okay with just working on the symptoms of the problem. So I wanted to focus on the problem itself, which is our linear economy. And I see the circular economy as its antidote. So that's what I'm intent on doing. And that's why we work in this particular sector. It has the power to shift markets. And I think that is just enormously encouraging. I see every challenge that comes on the table as an opportunity. And I think it's just about mobilizing that energy in everyone that understands the circular economy, or at least the linear, to start taking action in one form or another.
Very inspirational. Ben, you actually have circular economy in your title.
I do. Well, that reflects a change. Hey, my title started off as product stewardship, and I was looking at regulatory barriers to getting products to market. So I think it tells a story in itself. But No, I became very interested in this around 20 years ago when I started my PhD, and I was looking at processing of rare earths for magnets and looking at sort of novel techniques for making them. I won't go into the full thesis, but at that time, I mean, there was some interesting facts. If you looked at the applications for rare earth magnets, which was, it's a much smaller field then than it is now. We looked at things like a car. A car in the 70s and 80s had one magnet in it. It was in the speedometer. Today, they probably have around 200 in the different motors, actuators, everything else. And then you start rolling that forward and looking at the direction of travel of car ownership versus, economic development and the way that the population's growing. And that's what really got me interested in circular economy, was this, like, how on earth are we going to provide materials to satisfy that growing economic demand around the world? So that decoupling resource use from economic growth, that's just such a fundamental problem for us, I think, and on a personal level that I still struggle with. And the only way we can do it is designing systems different, to use materials differently. So I've always been working on that kind of track, and I think circular economy in a way is nothing new, but what I think it does is it packages a lot of these concepts, from environmental ecology and eco-efficiency and all these things that things that I've touched on over the years. It brings it all together, and I think that's for me, that's the great thing about circular economy. It's the breadth of it at the moment.
Yes, it's very exciting. Doug, what about you, and especially technology? Like, it's such a niche thing.
Well, technology underpins many things, but I'll come on to that in a sec. Our collective desire as consumers for stuff should not damage people or planet, and I think all of us agree with that. But how do we know? Increasingly, brands recognize they need to be able to prove it. And that means that you need data. You need an understanding of what is going on in the bowels of your supply chain at tier N, where previously you have really had only a murky view of what goes on past tier 1 of your supply chain. There are exceptions. We talked earlier about the Kimberley process. Materials like cobalt have had a sharp focus, as have conflict minerals, and therefore there's a far higher degree of transparency, and we're a long way off solving those problems in those supply chains than you would find in many others. But fundamentally, today, the technologies exist to enable meaningful visibility into a supply chain. And by the way, traceability is not the same as transparency. We live in a world where commercial confidentiality is important. One needs to be able to disclose without necessarily sharing everything publicly. And there are some quite sophisticated privacy preserving technologies now that can provide proofs that something has happened without disclosing the underlying data. And even 3 years ago, these sorts of technologies were not really available or capable of being employed, in the real world. They are today. We operate in a nascent space. I expect 10, 15 years from now, supply chain traceability will be ubiquitous.
I really love that all of you are passionate about this sort of broader sense and, principles as well. That is very motivating. Peter, I'm going to hand back to you to help us wrap up. And thank you for taking questions as well, Peter.
No, thank you. And I'll just quickly answer your question, because it's such a good question. But I'm a strategist and I'm a practitioner at the same time, so it's a bit schizophrenic sometimes. But when I draw the sustainability triangle, right, the interaction of profitability, the environment, and sort of society and the social contract, circular economy keeps popping up in the middle, right, with a very, very strong link in terms of the current and the future state of the industry, sort of. So that's the strategist sort of answer to your question. And the practitioner answer is our aluminium colleagues, right? When I see what can be achieved in the aluminium industry, and that's not a real comment about the possibility within reach of producing a carbon-free metal, and the partnerships that we're forming with our customers, and the partnerships we're forming with technology providers, and the amount of recycling and the amount of sort of the real life circular economy that's taking place in that industry is a very encouraging thing to see. So that gets me out of bed every morning in terms of just seeing what can be done and how that goes. Shreya, you asked me to sum this conversation up, and it's a really difficult task because it's been such a tremendous conversation. And when I introduced this panel, I knew this was going to be a good one, but I think it's been a tremendous conversation. So that's good. I'll try this. Actually, I mentioned it's like a bit of a Manchurian candidate sort of response. He mentioned the word matrix, and then I just went into sort of matrix mode. And I drew a 2x2 sort of drawing here, and I had on the one axis I had process and purpose. These are your words in terms of finding our way of how do we connect the dots between a real purpose for this industry and our companies, and then the processes that we deploy. And on the other axis, I sort of drew sort of a legal lens and the morality, or the legal lens or the moral lens. And it gives you 4 very interesting quadrants in terms of sort of legal processes and the moral purpose and everything in between. And I think that's the journey we're on as an industry. And circular economy is very much such a, not just a common denominator, but it's a perfect representation of all 4 quadrants, where we've got both an opportunity and the responsibility to make it connect the dots and crack the code, or whatever you term want to use, and then make it a reality. And there are more opportunities here than challenges, and therefore there lies the optimism that I'd like to leave this meeting with. So thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.